As the Indian Wars died down by the end of the 1870s, so did the heyday of the cattle drives. In retrospect, the cattle drives were only a brief period in the American West. In this brief section, we'll look at the reasons that the cattle drives died. The first reason was that the so-called beef bonanza became a called beef bust. So many people rushed into the cattle business seeing people like McCoy making money that overstocking drove prices down and profits went down, and so it was sort of a classic bubble that popped. Another more obvious reason for the end of the cattle drives was the spread of the railroads southward. By the late 1870s, the railroads had reached the major Texas range country. By the 1880s, almost 40,000 miles of track had been laid west of the Mississippi. Uh, New routes included the Southern Pacific from New Orleans to Southern California, the Santa Fe from Kansas City to Southern California, and the Northern Pacific, which ran from Duluth, Minnesota to Portland, Oregon. Still another reason the cattle drives ended by the late 1870s and early 1880s was that the cattlemen learned that longhorns could survive on winter wheat and in colder climates. They could graze throughout the Great Plains, which led to the so-called, quote, open range grazing. Assuming that Indian-controlled land was owned by no one, and that government-owned land was unfairly reserved for the farmer through the Homestead Act, cattlemen simply helped themselves, treating the land as a free commodity for anyone who seized it and put it to use. Cattlemen informally recognized the range right to grazing. After claiming as much land as they could under the Homestead Act rules, cattlemen would simply allow their cattle to graze up to the next divide, the point that the land sloped down to the next creek. By the 1880s, there were approximately 7.5 million cattle grazing on the Great Plains. This open range grazing still required cowboys because owners needed to designate their cattle with branding and periodically have the quote roundup of cattle to bring them to market. Of course, perhaps the one of the biggest reasons for the cattle drives ending in the late 1870s and early 1880s was the influx of thousands of farmers in the Great Plains. They were finally taking advantage of the Homestead Act. Many were new immigrants from Germany or Norway or Sweden, and roughly a third of the farmers on the Great Plains were foreign-born by the 1880s. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, a number of factors had convinced farmers that the Great Plains were not a great American desert, as Horace Greeley had said, but rather a potential breadbasket in a place that they could make a living. So as the farmers came in, the cattle drives were impossible anyway. This concludes the brief discussion on the end of the cattle drives.